Here is Genetically Modified Skeptic and New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman making the case that the Gospel of John shows strong outgroup bias and is anti-Jewish.
Outgroup bias in the Gospel of John. Outgroup bias is a tendency toward negative characterizations, feelings, or ideas about people who are not a part of our in-group. Especially when the lines of group identity are drawn strongly, people tend to think of those outside their group negatively. A Christian development of this bias can be seen in the Gospels. In the Gospel of Mark, which scholars believe was the first gospel written, the Jewish chief priests bring Jesus to the Roman governor Pilate, a crowd urges Pilate to crucify him, and Pilate hands Jesus over to Roman soldiers to be crucified. In John, the last gospel written, things are a bit different. There, the blame for Jesus' crucifixion is placed on the Jews as a people.
I think what's happening is that over time, there's increasing conflict between Jews who don't believe in Jesus and Jews who do believe in Jesus, and then non-Jews who believe in Jesus. I think it's largely just over the specific claim that Jesus is the Messiah. Most Jews thought this was a ridiculous claim, because the Messiah was supposed to be a powerful figure who set up a kingdom and destroyed the enemy and ruled Israel. And Jesus was the opposite. He was arrested by the enemy and publicly humiliated and tortured to death. And to say he's the Messiah was fairly ludicrous for most Jews, and so they didn't buy it. And Christians, here again, you have this thing where Christians can't understand it. Even today, I mean, my students, my undergraduate students don't understand. Why don't Jews see that Jesus is the Messiah? I mean, it says in the Old Testament that he has to suffer, that he has to die, that he has to be raised from the dead, that he's going to do miracles, he's going to be born of a virgin. They go down the list of all these things. The Old Testament says so. Can't Jews read? I mean, are they stupid? Are they blind? What? I don't, they generally don't get it. And in early Christianity, they didn't get it either, but they did know that, there were far more Jews in the world than Christians. Christians were this tiny sect, and they felt ganged up on. And so as that happened, Christian authors started blaming Jews more and more for killing their own Messiah. And this does come to a kind of a fevered pitch in John in ways that the readers wouldn't notice probably in English. But in John, it says that the scribes and the chief priests nonetheless insisted that he crucify him. And so Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. What? to the priests and the scribes? Are you kidding me? But often you don't get that in English, because some translations will say, so Pilate handed him over to the soldiers to be crucified, which is not what it says. It says to them, and the antecedent is these Jewish leaders. And so here, literally, the Jewish leaders crucify Jesus. And so this is the beginning of this, this trope that Jews killed their Messiah, so they're Christ killers.
This is another passage that has inspired certain readers to embrace bias against their outgroup, in this case, Jewish people. What's particularly interesting to me here is that this is a result of how the gospel story changed over time, coming to serve the biases of its believers as it was told and retold.
Is that a fact?
And here is philosopher Tim McGrew dismantling Ehrman's argument.
Ehrman actually has several developmental hypotheses, and he pulls these out whenever they're handy. As we move from earlier to later Gospels, the Gospels, here's one, progressively shift the blame for Jesus' death from the Romans to the Jews. This is one that Bart brought up in the debate that he and I had. Some of you may have heard it this past summer. Another one, which he talks about in his book, Jesus Interrupted, is that Jesus becomes increasingly detached and inhuman in the crucifixion narratives. He's very human, vulnerable, crushed, bewildered in Mark, and then as you move on through the narratives, he becomes less and less and less so. So let's look at these one at a time. We'll start with the anti-Semitic trajectory. Here's what he said about this in our debate. The most striking feature of the traditions about Jesus being condemned to death is that Pilate becomes increasingly innocent with the passing of time, and the Jewish people become increasingly guilty. That's because as Christians were telling and retelling their stories, they were in heightened situations of antagonism with Jews, and Christians began portraying Jews as the ones responsible for Jesus' death. And so that's why in the later sources, Pilate has to have his arm twisted, because that shows that in fact it's the Jews who were at fault. Bart is a past master in the art of spinning out a plausible line. Does anyone notice anything odd about this particular one? Who was Saul of Tarsus? Hint, he was not a notable Athenian philosopher. Christians had problems with the Jews going all the way back to the early church in Jerusalem. That was ground zero for the persecution of the early church. You can't read the book of Acts without seeing that. The book of Acts is not Bart's friend here. But let's look at his description of the accounts. See what he has to say. In Mark, quote from him, again from our debate, it's basically Pilate and the Jewish leaders pretty much agreeing that this needs to be done. Okay, so kind of share and share alike in the blame. But in Matthew, well, there's this very dramatic statement that the Jewish leaders make. His blood be on us and our children. Oh boy, okay, well that's certainly, definitely something that makes it clear that the Jews are to blame, right? And then in Luke, he says, the innocence of Pilate is being heightened by Pilate's declaring 3 times that he finds no guilt in Jesus, and by his sending Jesus to Herod Antipas to see if Herod will do the deed and get it off Pilate's plate. And as far as John goes, well, says Bart, when the Jewish priests insist that Pilate crucify him, the Greek text says, so Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. The antecedent there are the Jewish priests. They're the ones who crucified Jesus in the Gospel of John. No, really, he said this. And some of you are sitting there thinking, I've read John 18 and 19 recently, and I don't recall that. Right, okay, we'll get to that toward the end. Problem number 1, Mark doesn't fit the pattern. Remember, the pattern is supposed to be Roman responsibility more stressed early, Jewish responsibility more stressed late. Okay, all of the Gospels describe the plot of the Jewish leaders and the chief priests to kill Jesus. All of them, without exception. No pattern there. Mark records the bribe given to Judas in the plot to have Jesus betrayed in the garden. That's Mark. That's early. These guys are in it up to their necks early on. Mark, like the other Gospels, tells us that those who arrested Jesus in Gethsemane were sent from the chief priests. Yep. Mark tells us that Jesus was tried by night before the high priest. This is not sounding like the Jews were sort of sharing responsibility with the Romans. Mark tells us the Jewish leaders delivered him to Pilate personally, a package delivery. And in Mark 15, 9 and 14, Pilate tries to get the Jewish crowd to allow him to release Jesus. Remember this? Oh, well, we have a custom. How about if I let him go? Well, how does this fit the pattern? Does this fit the pattern at all? No. It looks like a pattern so long as we just cherry-picked a few examples and lined them up in a neat row. Once we start reading our Bibles for ourselves, we find this is not the pattern at all. Okay, how about Matthew, though? He's supposed to be next, right? Well, his blood be on us and our children. That's a very striking statement, no doubt. But do you remember the order in which Bart said these things developed? Matthew's before Luke and he's before John, and they don't report that statement at all. You can bet that if that statement had been in John, it would have been the star piece of evidence that it's being developed that way, but it's not. And so he mentions this here, even though that's not going to fit the overall pattern, because it fits one part of the pattern. The contrast that he wants to show is development from Mark to Matthew. Having done this, he dismisses that bit of evidence like a taxi that he no longer needs. He doesn't want to travel to the end of the line on that one. How about Luke? Well, besides the fact that Luke doesn't have the dramatic hand-washing scene found in Matthew and the dramatic utterance there's also the fact that in Luke 23, we find there's a great crowd of Jewish people following Jesus on the Via Dolorosa, following him to the cross, weeping and mourning as Jesus is led out to be crucified. How is that anti-Jewish? But it's supposed to be more anti-Jewish than Matthew, because Matthew came earlier. That just does not fit the pattern at all. If I were asking you to take my word for this, if you didn't own Bibles, I could understand some skepticism. But please, I don't think I'm bringing you anything that you didn't know already from your own reading of your own Bibles. This is Bart's argument. Something is wrong. How about John? Well, besides the fact that he doesn't have that dramatic scene found in Matthew, he doesn't have the awed Roman centurion saying, "Surely this was the Son of God." But he's the last author writing. Isn't he supposed to be the most pro-Roman? How about the fact that in Mark, the Jewish leaders mock Jesus on the cross, right? If you're the Christ, come down. But not in John. If John is supposed to be further along the trajectory of anti-Semitism, why is it that John doesn't have that, but the very first thing does? This doesn't make any sense.
Hold on a sec. This video is all about pinpointing biases in the Bible, but do you see the irony here?
Ironic.
Many experts label cherry picking as a classic example of selective attention, commonly known as confirmation bias. It involves selecting data to suit your desired outcome, which doesn't always reflect reality. Bart's trying to break down biases in John's authorship, leaning towards an anti-Jewish interpretation, but in doing so, it sure looks like he's revealing his own bias against the text.
Oh, the irony! It's too much!